world. Now, one of the things that is unique about stewardship is that some of it really just never changes. There's not a lot of new stuff to share other than to share experiences in different ways to present it. Hopefully you will walk away with something that will be helpful. And that's one reason why the chat room is so important, is you can share your ideas, your experiences, present your questions, and Mark and I will try to respond to those as quickly and as best we can. And if we're unable to answer those this evening during the workshop, we encourage you to reach out to us beyond this time together, because that's who we are, that's what we do, and we want to be a resource to you. So before I kind of kick us off with a prayer and then move into my part of the workshop, Mark, is there anything that I have missed or that you would like to say or share?
Thank you, David, and good evening again to everyone. Echoing David's sentiments, so glad to have you, and very, very impressed with our turnout on both evenings. It just reminds me again of the value of our connection, that the conference can offer these workshops as a way to help our churches and to stay connected to each other. We are recording the session. Last night was recorded. Tonight will be recorded. It'll be available for download soon, probably sometime next week or so. So just keep that in mind as well. But anyway, welcome. Glad to have you. And David, take it away.
All right. If everyone would just bow with me. Gracious God, once again, we come to you and first of all, give you thanks for the many blessings that you have given to us. This day is a blessing, and this opportunity to come together this evening to learn how to be better stewards and to be better leaders in your church. All of this, God, is a blessing. So help us to open our eyes and our ears and our hearts and our minds so that we might truly receive those blessings and be so empowered to go out and offer to others. I give you thanks, God, for each person, each church, each ministry that is represented here, and ask that you help them to be the best possible leader, whether lay or clergy, that they can possibly be. So now we ask that you send your Holy Spirit upon our time and guide us. We offer this prayer in your Son's name, and all the people said, amen. Folks, you received an email earlier today from Mark King, and it had two, not only the body of the email, but also had two attachments related to the PowerPoints that Mark referenced. My PowerPoint that I'm going to share with you is going to look a little differently tonight, and there's a reason behind that. Number one, you guys, this group this evening are what we call the experienced folks in stewardship. You might have served in your leadership role in finance for a while, whether that be clergy or lay, staff member of a church. And so there are things that you've already heard and things that you've already seen that we thought, well, we're not going to spend a lot of time on that. Some of the stuff we're talking about, whether it is a pandemic or post-pandemic world, still applies. So we're going to kind of go through some of this stuff, and then I'm going to stop before I turn it over to Mark and let him pick it up and ask you if you have any questions or comments. So if you have the PowerPoint and you're going to try to follow along, it's going to be hard because I have summarized it a little bit. And so you might not be able to follow it. But let's talk about what stewardship is or generosity and stewardship as a spiritual practice. You just heard me slip up there and I talked about stewardship. Words are important. And one of the things that we have to be mindful of is that when we use the word stewardship, there are certain things that are implied, and there are certain ways that people look at that word and what that word means. And one of the things that we have done and promoted within the world of the United Methodist Foundations throughout the connection is to try to move away from the word stewardship. I mean, we're not saying that it's not worthy of being used, but we're just trying to use a different language. These are different times and we have to approach things in different ways. And we've learned that very clearly in the midst of the pandemic. But when we talk about stewardship as an act of generosity based on our faith journey, the newsletter here at the foundation the title is Faith and Generosity. And what we're talking about in the articles and the reports that we give there are people being good stewards, whether it's with their money, whether it's with their time, whether it's with their talents. So you've probably heard this before. You certainly have if you've heard a presentation from me, but try to think of different ways to communicate the idea of stewardship. And often one of the first things that people think about, especially stewardship in the local church, is the Stewardship Campaign. And so when we think about stewardship campaigns, they often end up bringing up ideas of fundraising. And stewardship in the church, faith and generosity, is so much more than just reaching a dollar goal. And so we need to be very clear with the folks in the pews about what stewardship is not. And you heard me in my prayer moving down to what stewardship is. It's a recognition of all that we have is of God, from God, and to be used for God's good. And so when you can start talking in this language and in these terms, it helps put a different perspective from just another fundraising event that the folks seated in your pews may be participating in, whether it be in the community or it be some other group that they're a part of. But I will tell you that it's not easy. Don't go back to your church and say, folks, we're going to start talking about generosity and faith and expect everyone to fully understand what you're talking about. You're going to have to spend some time in conversation and in dialogue about that. And you'll actually hear more about that as Mark shares with us later. Now, last night when I moved the slides, they didn't move the first go round. Mark, did they move this time?
Not yet. Not yet.
You do not see theological and doctrinal basis for. So last night I had to go out and come back in. So let's see if I can get it this time.
It might also help to use the slideshow feature. Okay, there you go. There you go.
Okay. So when we talk about generosity as a spiritual practice, we also have to think about the theology behind it, and as United Methodist, what we say about that. And of course, the folks that went through last night, we got very specific about some of the scripture, the Malachi 3:10 and Matthew 6:21, John 6:1 through 13, some of the more traditional scriptures that are related to stewardship and or giving. And once again, when you're dealing with a pandemic, post-pandemic world, we've already learned how to communicate the message that we have to give to others in different ways. So what are some non-traditional scriptures that may be important to you that you relate to giving and generosity and stewardship? I know one of mine is Matthew 17:20, and I learned it the old way. If ye have faith as a grain of mustard seed, nothing shall be impossible unto ye. And what that doesn't say anything about giving, but what it says to me internally in my mind and in my heart, to have faith that what you're doing is making a difference. And even faith that when you give, that it's not going to hurt, because sometimes we have folks, and ourselves included, we don't want to give because we think, well, I don't want to give that up because it means I'm going to have to sacrifice somewhere else. But these are lessons and things that can be helpful to our folks seated in the pew. And of course, we have in Scripture the biblical principle of the tithe. And, you know, one of the things that we want to focus on the tithe is that that's the goal, but we don't want to be judgmental of people that have not reached that tithe yet. And to understand that it's a part of our discipleship journey. So we want to encourage people to move toward the tithe and not be critical of people that haven't made it there. Of course, also as good United Methodists that you are, being on this Zoom call, we have heard repeatedly about John Wesley in his sermon on money, earning, saving, and giving, and the importance of that. So be certain that you pull all of this into a bigger picture and a larger message of what it means to act out in faith and to be generous. One of the things that last night seemed to really strike a chord with the folks that were on the call had to do with providing different methods to give to the church. When I first started teaching stewardship here at the foundation, we didn't even talk about this. The way people gave to the church was when the offering plate came by them, or they would mail their check in to the church office, and the deposit would be made, and that's how it was all handled. And, you know, now with COVID, we're not even passing the plates in most churches. And so there are opportunities there, especially not only because of the pandemic and what we'll move into in the post-pandemic world, but I can tell you my 21 and 25-year-old daughters, they don't write checks. You know, they don't handle money the way I do at 57. So we have to respond to that. So you include both for those people in the older generations possibly that want to still give a check at the church or send it in. You allow for that, of course, but also the various electronic methods. You know, even texting a dollar amount to the church. Providing a debit card number to the church so that they can run it through. And of course, one of the things that we shared last night is the Western North Carolina Conference portal that, thanks to Mark King, was set up at the beginning of the pandemic because this was a concern. If people weren't coming to church, how would this affect giving? And he was able to share last night that in the last 2 years, in excess of $400,000 has come into the conference and gone right back out to the local church in giving. So as the conference portal focus or actually ends up being a vessel for those monies to come in and then go back out to the local church. So this is an example, and $400,000, like I said last night, I like to round up almost $500,000 that might not have made it to the local churches came through that portal. The other thing that we want to do is to encourage healthy personal finance practices when we talk about different methods to give, and that relates specifically to credit cards. You know, we don't want people to start incurring debt as a bad financial practice in giving to a church. So I'll speak in a few minutes about some of the ongoing opportunities throughout the year to emphasize healthy financial practices. So let's talk now about encouraging a generous church. First and foremost, money follows mission. One of my very first meetings on site with a church here in Western North Carolina, and I'll say it's happened repeatedly over the last 20 years, was about a church that was having financial difficulty, and they called the foundation and wanted us to come out and consult with the financial leadership. And as I sat in the church parlor of that church, I realized that they didn't have clarity about their mission. And we know from experience that money follows mission. When you believe in something, you're more likely to participate in it, whether you do that physically or whether you do that financially. So if your church does not have a clear mission beyond the United Methodist Church's mission of making disciples of Jesus Christ for the transformation of the world, we know that in each area where the churches are located, because of the demographics, the location, whatever it is, that you carry out that mission of making disciples differently. So get clarity on that. Make sure that the leaders, you as a leader and other leaders in the church, believe in that mission, that the mission is communicated clearly to not only the rest of the congregation, but also that it is communicated clearly to the folks that may visit you or visit your website or tune in on a Sunday morning to watch a sermon on Facebook or on Zoom. And one of the best ways to communicate that mission is to use a testimony. And I'm speaking mainly here, even though I know we have several pastors on the call tonight, but lay people, I'm going to encourage you to speak up and to share your testimony about what it means to financially support the mission and ministry of your local church. Because so often people will shut down when they start hearing the pastor talk about giving, because they think, well, he or she has a reason to want me to give because that's their salary, that's their benefits. But when a lay person who is just like the person seated next to them in the pew or in the chair or wherever in the Bible study, in the small group, when they get up and share, they can relate to that and say, well, if they can do it, then I can do it. So the next point that we want to make in encouraging a generous church is to move away from the campaign culture. I referenced earlier about, having the annual stewardship campaign, and that was viewed as a fundraising campaign to meet whatever the projected budget was going to be for the upcoming year. So one of the things that we can't emphasize enough, and there are statistics that will support this, that churches and ministers that teach and preach stewardship or faith and generosity throughout the year have a better response from the people seated in the pews. Not only are there more giving units, but the dollar amounts are typically higher. So what this means, and I happen to have an example here on my desk. One of the new things that you've probably seen come out from Westpath and Abingdon Press is Saving Grace. The foundation is getting ready in the next 2 months to send out information about how we can help you with that particular curriculum. That's just one of many different things that we can promote as far as ongoing stewardship classes in the church. We also need to focus, when we move away from this annual campaign culture, that it's an expression of our faith versus that annual fundraising campaign. We don't give because the church needs the money. We give because we have been given to. And that is an important distinction to make. We give back to the mission and ministry of the church because God has given to us, not to reach that dollar amount. And then, of course, I've already picked up on the last bullet point about offer personal stewardship studies like Saving Grace. I saw Sharon Lee, a pastor here in the Western North Carolina Conference, many years ago. Sharon probably remembers, and some of you do. We took Adam Hamilton's book, Enough, and we supplemented it with videos for each chapter that we encouraged folks to use as small group studies in the church. And you can start with the Sunday school classes, or any of the small group settings that you might have are a great way to start something like that. But something that you may not have thought about is, if you are a part of the finance team or finance committee or whatever you call it, and or stewardship team at your church, start with that group. If you're going to be out there promoting faithful stewardship, then learn about it yourself and buy into it so that you can speak more confidently about it. So that's another way to offer a stewardship study on an individual basis. And I want you to think about this. If the goal is for the church to be a good and healthy steward, then we've got to start with the individuals that make up that church. And then it will overflow into the church as a whole. So church as faithful steward, now that this is the third area of focus, the church as the faithful steward. First and foremost, the church has to have the practice of being trustworthy. You know, people are hesitant, and I'm sure many of you are this way. I get calls all the time, people asking me to give donations to different things. Some of them are ministries, some of them I've never heard of, some of them I vaguely know. But if I don't know about them, I'm probably not going to give to them because I can't trust that the money's going to be used in the way that they say it will be used. So one of the things that we have to do is offer full transparency, follow the book of discipline. Mark King will talk more about this in his stuff. We need to make sure that the budget supports the mission and ministry. If you are going to promote the budget, which I would encourage you to, then make certain that you're using the money for what you said you would use it for as approved by the governing body. And then, of course, debt is something that is a challenge for us as individuals, certainly as institutions. We need to be good stewards when we're looking at debt. We need to shop rates and terms. You know, some people, especially church growth specialists, would say to you that if a church is not in debt, then it's probably not growing. If you look at growing churches, things are happening, they're renovating, they're building, they're buying, and that means they're probably taking on debt. So for some of us, and especially some of us sitting in the pews, we're going to have to get a really different view and idea in our minds of what debt is. And so often we think it's bad, it's a bad thing. But in a church, and it can be, don't get me wrong, but in a church setting, taking on debt can mean that things are happening and the ministries are growing, and that's why you're taking on the debt. So communicate all that clearly. And then the church as faithful steward, you want to plan for the future. This is where so often churches and ministries in general run into problems, because they're focusing on the immediate, they're focusing on the here and now. And I understand that. Sometimes the here and now and the immediate just has such a huge spotlight and a really loud voice on it that you can't think beyond the here and now. But healthy churches always plan for the future. And some of the things that they do to help with that is to promote member gift planning, or planned giving, as we call it in the business and in the foundation world. And there are some real benefits to the members or donors that participate in that gift planning. There can be some tax benefits. There can be some benefits for personal income. And there can also just be the satisfaction in their mind and in their heart that they're truly helping the church that they love beyond their lifetime. They're also setting an example for others sitting in the pews when they do that. So this is something that the foundation can come in and help you with. I encourage you to go to our website and check some of those things out under the planned giving part. Also, planning for the future, it certainly includes endowment funds. Many of your churches have endowment funds. I believe and I promote that every church should have at least one endowment fund, and I call that the general endowment fund. That the church in this case would carry that endowment and the assets of that endowment on their books. However, there are individuals sitting in your pews that may want to establish endowment funds. And if they would like to do that, they can do that through the United Methodist Foundation. And we will oversee and be the fiduciary for that particular endowment fund. And since all of you are experienced in stewardship, I'm assuming that you know the definition or the idea behind an endowment. So I'm not going to go into detail about that. But of course, when you set up an endowment, really what you're doing is helping to fund ministry in perpetuity. And it is invested in wise and prudent ways so that it continues to generate income while it also grows over a period of time. And so this is truly a way for folks to carry out a ministry that is near and dear to their hearts, whether it be an individual or a church, forever and ever, way beyond our lifetimes. So that is a summary of the PowerPoint that I sent you, or Mark sent you with the email earlier today. I have not been looking at the chat. I have actually been going through the presentation. So Mark, is there anything in there that we need to address?
So we had a couple questions about the giving portal. I hope I answered. Thelma had a question about what's the rationale for adding versus using your own. If you have your own service already, there's no need to change. If you're happy with it, this was set up primarily for so many of our churches that really don't even have a website and don't have an existing platform or a way to obtain one. So that's what the portal is for. It's not there's no push to use ours. It's just available if you don't have anything. And then Kim asked about the author of Saving Grace, and Lynn Gilbert put a link in the chat for where you can get the material from Abington. And finally, Larry Watson suggested adding stock donations to the list for those who can maximize deduction. You want to say a word about that, David?
Yes, Larry, thank you. I inadvertently left that out. This is a service that the foundation will do for you because so many churches do not know how to handle stock gifts. And you may have folks seated in your pews that they were given stock or they bought stock a long time ago. It's grown substantially. And what I tell folks is you don't want that stock to see the light of day. Because if they go ahead and sell that stock and take the appreciation on it, they're going to have to pay taxes on it. But if they transfer it directly to our clearing account at the United Methodist Foundation, then we have a standing order with BB&T Scott Stringfellow or Truist Scott Stringfellow, whatever they're called now, to sell that stock, and then we send it to you. So they are actually giving it to the foundation. We acknowledge receipt of it for their tax purposes, and then we send you the proceeds. So you can go on our website under resources and see that there is a printable, downloadable instruction sheet for that on how to make that happen.
And Thelma has a question, David. Believes in year-round stewardship education campaign, but what about a pledge campaign in the current environment?
You know, this is where I tell folks, you really need to take the pulse of your congregation. And I know that we work with churches that the annual stewardship campaign, I'm going to call it that, even though I'm telling you not to, it is a time of year in that church that is as almost, not quite, but almost as exciting as Advent, Christmas, and Easter. You know, it's when everybody comes out and they celebrate what the church has done because of the way they carry out that particular campaign. And so, you know, if a church like that, who is accustomed to doing that, stopped doing it, I think it could have a really negative effect on the life of the church and the excitement that's going on in the church. Now, I've had a lot of folks tell me that the folks over the last 2 years have pushed back, and it's been, you know, you're being insensitive when you're having a campaign in the middle of a pandemic. But remember what I was saying in that, I think it was like the third slide that I shared with you. If you focus on stewardship and faith and generosity as an act of discipleship, as an act of faithfulness, does it really matter if we're in the middle of a pandemic or not? So, but you've got to be careful with that messaging, and you've got to make sure you build the bridge there as to why you're doing it, that it's not about raising money, but it's about helping them grow in their faith journey.
I think that's all the questions shown up so far, David. Good job. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
All right, so we're going to shift now and talk a little bit about the work of the treasurer and finance committee and whatnot. I'm going to share my screen and talk a little bit about this. And again, I'm like David, this is the only slide I'm going to refer to since I sent out the 101 earlier today and it posted it in the chat room if you, for some reason, didn't get the email or were not able to open it up. What I'd just like to take a few moments to do tonight, because we do have another presentation before we get away, and we are committed to finishing at 8:30. So those of you on here last night knew we did that. I just want to hit some highlights. I developed this PowerPoint this January to send out for the churches. It's on my webpage. By the way, my webpage is the conference's webpage, except you put a backslash at the end of org and type in treasurer, and it takes you to a whole bunch of resources that we have for you all. You all are the experienced veterans, which is the way we designed this workshop and promoted it. So a lot of this you already know. I think you've come to some previous workshops that we've had. I hope I don't go through it too fast, but just bear in mind that what we're trying to do is to cover the things that are really important to remind you so that you kind of get that rejuvenation that comes from this work and the things you're supposed to do. So anyway, the role of treasurer and financial secretary. The Book of Discipline has some very specific guidance under the Committee on Finance in that section of local church organization. It does presume that the treasurer is the one who does the dispensing of the expenses, writing the checks, taking care of that, and the financial secretary is the one who receives or records contributions and things like that. If your church has it opposite, that's fine. You know, I think the discipline makes a presumption there. It doesn't have to be. The key, though, the absolute key, and we beat this drum all the time, is that these have to be two separate positions. You don't want the right hand knowing what the left hand's doing. You don't want the same person who receives the money to be the one that dispenses it. And so that's why these two very important duties are lined up. And it's also very important in the discipline, reminding you they can't be members of the same immediate family. That defeats the whole purpose with this. So just keep that in mind. I say immediate family, that's like children, siblings, spouse, parents, in-laws. I know in the South we're all related to somebody somewhere. All of us are. But, you know, the immediate family is the one to be very careful of because it's so easy for something to happen. Now, segregation of duties, that again kind of takes this another step further with the treasurer and financial secretary, is to make sure that you have arm's length from the responsibilities of managing the finances and the money of the church. This is critically important. And I know sometimes people say, well, you mean you don't trust us? It's not about trust at all. It's about protection. And I would not work at a church that does not afford me some protection so that there is enough segregation of duties, there's enough separation between the incoming of the money and the going out of the money, so that I would never be accused. I could not even falsely have that thrown at me. I put in the PowerPoint the temptation triangle, embezzlement triangle that happens so many times. And when you remove those three powerful forces, pressure, opportunity, and rationalization, you have far less opportunity for embezzlement to happen. Some of you have been in churches where embezzlement occurred. And let me tell you, it takes years to heal from that. And you never, ever want to have to go through that. Good, faithful, godly people get caught up in life circumstances sometimes, and these temptations come along, and they're able to very quickly and easily take church money and think they get away with it. You just want to make sure that doesn't happen. So the segregation of duties between the treasurer, the financial secretary, all the way to the counters. Remember again, never let any one person be by themselves with the church finances, cash or whatever, from the offering plate to the bank. You just don't ever want to allow opportunity like that to happen. Let me pause there. Are there questions related to treasurer, financial secretary, segregation of duties?
Mark, I'm not seeing any in the chat room
Okay.
to me or to everyone, maybe to you directly. But.
All right. Let's move into the joy of payroll. And I put this into PowerPoint, the joy of payroll church style, because the clergy person, and let's just focus on clergy for a moment, although I know we have a lot of non-clergy folks working in our church staffs, and they're equally important. But just take the clergy out for just a moment. Clergy are the most complicated taxpayer, I think, in the Internal Revenue Code. And here's the reason. It comes down to it basically this. For income tax purposes, this is what traditionally we call federal and state withholding, whatever, that we pay tax on our income. Clergy are seen by the IRS as employees of the salary paying unit, which in our system is the local church. There are employees for income tax. And then people were, well, no, wait a minute, I heard clergy were self-employed. Well, yes and no, because they're employees for income tax, but over here with Social Security tax, FICA tax, they are self-employed, but that's the only self-employed that enters into the picture. Nowhere else are they really self-employed. They are self-employed only for Social Security. And I have to go back to the New Deal, the 1930 Social Security Act was put into place. And then the pastor was really the only employee of the church. And because of separation of church and state back then, ruling in that climate, they didn't feel like they could tax the church for the employer's share. So that's why clergy were deemed to be self-employed for Social Security. And it has never changed. Now, when non-clergy employees started coming into the life of the church, Well, that kind of went by the wayside. They said, oh, all right, we'll go ahead and tax the church for the employer's share. And then in addition to these two types of taxes, there is that all wonderful housing allowance or parsonage allowance, which is Internal Revenue Code 107, that clergy get a waiver of income tax on anything deemed housing or the value of their parsonage. Now, they got to pay it in Social Security. They don't get a waiver there. It's in income tax. The other thing that makes it so interesting if a church is in payroll, I remind you, is churches are not required to withhold income taxes on clergy. And they are prohibited from withholding Social Security tax and matching it. That's almost illegal to do. Now, what you can do, and I often say this is between the clergy person and the church wanting to come to an agreement, you can do what's called voluntary withholding. And I always recommend that the clergy person get with their tax professional and get a dollar amount that would include both what they owe in income tax themselves and what they owe in Social Security self-employment tax. And whatever that dollar amount divided by the number of pay periods the church pays, if it's bi-weekly, bi-monthly, monthly, whatever, that's withheld from their pay. And it is sent in like any other of the withholding taxes that you send in for other staff. If you do that, then when you do your W-2, and by the way, clergy do not get a 1099. Again, they're not self-employed. They get a W-2. But whatever you withhold in the dollar amount they give you goes in box 2 on the W-2. Now, it looks like that's all federal withholding, which in the eyes of the IRS, it kind of is. But when a clergy person does their 1040 every year, they do their own tax return, all that enters into the reconciliation, they divvy it out on their tax return, and they get credit for the money that's sitting out. That's called voluntary withholding, but it's not a requirement, and church and pastor should work that together. Pastors, I tell you here on the webinar tonight is so important because I see it so happen anytime. Don't assume your church is withholding for you because they're not required to. Some of them have been used to doing it for a long time. Some of them have never done it because clergy typically will do estimated tax payments. Those sort of quarterly things we do when we're not withholding. So the moment your appointment starts, make sure you get this all worked out as to how you all are going to do it. Because that's the time to do it, not heartache down the road when April 15th hits. Employees get a W-2, non-clergy staff get a W-2 just like everybody else, but you do withhold from them. So be sure to make sure that's in place for your clergy staff, even if it's just part-time. They should be withheld, and they also have the Social Security tax, and you match it for those non-clergy staff and non-clergy personnel. One other thing about payroll is when do you issue a 1099? And that's typically the difference between a contractor that's working for your church versus an employee. Again, on my website, I do have a kind of a checklist that you can use to determine between the two. Sometimes the question comes up, well, the musicians that play in the band or do the instruments on Sunday morning, can they not be contracted and we just give them 1099 and not mess with Social Security? I will tell you that the IRS has become very strict on that of late and have ruled many times that musicians, because they have to come to church at a certain point, a certain date and time, even for rehearsal. A lot of times the instruments belong to the church. The church owns and purchases the music. So that all makes it like they really are employees. And they don't get a 1099, they get a W-2, and you match their Social Security wages. But if you have a lawn service or a janitorial service that comes in and they can do the job they have to do on their time, as long as it's done every week or whatever, and they bring a lot of their own equipment in, their own supplies, then yes, they can be contractors, not employees. And if you pay them more than $600 in a year, you give them a 1099. If you pay $599, you're not required to give them a 1099, although they are required to report it still. But it's 600 is the little mark for sending out a 1099. Got any questions on payroll?
Mark, something just, yeah, Thelma Wright just dropped one in. Do you see that one?
Sorry, I was a little late on asking the question back on the other one before going.
Oh, okay.
It says committee's job title. No, I think, well, you need a chairperson, I think, honestly, Thelma, just to moderate the meetings and to make sure that the committee is regularly scheduled and has membership and minutes are being taken and recording. It's the overall committee's work, but let's face it, a good chair, a good committee needs a leader of it just to kind of make sure all the boxes are being checked in the system that they have. So I would think you definitely need a chair for your committee. And this committee, the chair also represents the committee on various other roles in the church, such as the church council and what staff parish you may have the chair. I don't know. It depends on how you all want to organize that. All right, pension and benefits. Very quickly, you know that the conference will bill you for the church's part of their pastor's pension and for the pastor's health benefits. Now, in our system, we have 3 health plans for the active full-time clergy or 3/4 time clergy, and they make a contribution based on salary. Now, we can bill the clergy person that, or we can bill the church that if the church is withholding their contribution from their salary. So we work that out with you on our end. But the pastor's personal contribution to their UMPIP, their personal investment account, that's billed by Westpath, not us. And if you want to change what that amount is, either the pastor is getting a raise and they need to account for the difference in what the UMPIP contribution would be, or they just want to increase it on their own. There's a form on our webpage that you can use, but you send it to Westpath. And Westpath should be billing you for the clergy, for the pastor's personal contribution. So be sure on all that. But as far as the church's part of pension, we bill you for that. And pension starts with half-time, 3/4 time, or full-time. Anything above half-time, they're eligible for our pension product. Health plans are 3/4 and full-time that they're available for. Have a question on that? The maximum they can put into it, oh gosh, you think I should have that memorized? I think it's for under 50, I think it's 20,500 for 22. And then if you're over 50, you have I want to say it's $6,500 catch up. Don't quote me on that. I should have had that prepared. But that's the maximum that they can put in. I think it's around 27,500 for 2022 if they're over 50. It's 19,000, 20,000 if they are under 50 that they can put aside. They also cannot put in more than 50% of their compensation. So if they're part-time, they can't put in more and get the break for that. They can do it after tax. They can't do that before tax. Year-end report. This is what you're doing now for a lot of them. I saw a while ago, we're back down to the 50% mark. We've got a few more days. They are due Monday, January 31st. Lots of you are working on that. We really reduced it this year because let's face it, during the pandemic, a lot of things didn't happen that those questions asked for. So why put pressure on the churches to come up with stuff that was not applicable? So we're only doing tables 1 and 2 this year. I have gotten a lot of it. Where's table 3? It's not as bad. Well, I took it out. We're not asking questions on table 3 this year. This report actually goes back to this whole understanding of Methodism and Wesley and being accountable to each other. Now you probably go, why do I have to do this report? Well, Wesley thought it was important that we report to each other what we're doing. It was accountable. Now, granted, I think sometimes it's way too number focused, and I wish there was other ways that we could build in the accountability behind numbers. But that's the way it is right now. Please be careful with this. You just don't know the mistakes that can be made on these year-end reports. And at least in table 2, they're going to impact your apportionments because that's the data we take to calculate your apportionments. And you see that's the next item on the list to talk about. We take the average of certain expenses from table 3 over a 3-year period so that we don't just hit 1 year. But the average of 3 years, whatever those expenses might be, and that's put up against a multiplier of the annual conference's budget. Now you need to keep this in mind. It is the annual conference with your pastor and all your lay delegates that meet in annual session, decide, number 1, what the annual conference budget is going to be apportioned to the churches. It is not the treasurer's job. It is not CF&A's job. It is not the bishop's job to come up with a budget. We work on one and we present it to the conference, but the conference has the final say. So the conference decides the annual budget. The conference decides what the calculation formula will be. It hadn't been adjusted in several years now, I know, but it has been in the past. And the conference, the ones that vote on that. And as far as the rules of what is used in the calculation, those certain expenses, again, it is the decision of the annual conference. So please bear that in mind when we have that annual session, that those all things all do come in together with it. Certain expenses on table 3 or 2 are allowed, others we do not use. And in the PowerPoint, I spell out under apportionments what those things are. And we allocate that to the churches and on a fair share basis that what the formula takes into consideration a church's ability to be able to pay what is apportioned to them. 2022 saw an increase in apportionments for most of the churches, primarily because the general church apportionments, what we had in 21, was not allowed to be used in 22, and until the general conference meets and gets a lower number, we're not sure exactly where that's going to what's it going to take for down the road. We're listening, we're discerning, but the reason the 22 apportionment single-handedly, the conference's side was flat. The general church did go up. I think some questions are coming in, David, right?
Yes, actually comments about the change in the year-end report and how helpful the information is to share celebrations, but also to call out areas that may need to be called out. I did a real quick Google search about the maximum 2022 403B clergy contribution. You were correct if I heard you correctly, $20,500 for 2022. And if you're 50 or older, you can do an additional $6,500.
Well, I'm amazed the cobwebs up there really are not getting in the way.
Mark this down, Mark, and everybody. This was the night you were right.
So anyway, good. I appreciate the comments and the things that we're seeing there. All right, as we move on, let's look at taxes. Churches come under the United Methodist Church's 501c3 tax exemption on income. This means you do not pay income tax on the net revenue of a church. And also, you're able to receive contributions from donors who have the opportunity to, depending upon their tax status, make deductible contributions. I do need to tell you, though, with the recent tax law changes, 90% of taxpayers now use the standard deduction. However, they did tweak it last year and this year to where those who make contributions can still put them on their tax, put them on their tax return, and there's a little bit of a credit that you get for that now. So that was to try to help. There's a lot of clamor about, you know, the deductions for contributions going away, and they heard us and they did add that credit to it. But that doesn't mean the church doesn't pay tax. For non-clergy staff, you match your Social Security tax for them. You do withhold from non-clergy employees that are on your staff, and you can enter a voluntary withholding with clergy to withhold on tax. Sometimes you have to pay unrelated business income tax. Sometimes you may have to pay property tax in your county if you lose the exemption for religious purposes on property. For instance, if you have a parsonage and it is no longer, the pastor doesn't live in it, you're renting it out to an unrelated party, the county may come in and say, well, that's now a business enterprise, that's not being used for exemption purposes, you got to pay property tax on that. And you can pay unrelated business on income tax on rental property, on rentals, if you do, if the property is debt financed, you still have a mortgage on it. Now, if you don't have a mortgage on it, you don't have to worry about unrelated business income tax. But if you do have a mortgage on it, that enters into the picture. Taxes you don't pay, churches are exempt from paying federal and state unemployment tax. Churches are exempt from paying Social Security tax on clergy. So there, you know, there's some you pay, some you do, some you don't. In the PowerPoint, I do try to list as much as I can. Do you have a question on these?
No, I think someone is off of mute.
Yeah. Okay. And also, a question came about sales tax. Yes, you do pay sales tax. A lot of states will grant a certificate of exemption that you can show a vendor and you don't have to pay it. North Carolina is funny about that. I think they do have some exemption certificates, but it's like pulling teeth to get it. North Carolina prefers you to pay the sales tax and then apply for a sales tax refund twice a year. And you get the money back from the state. So you veterans know, create a receivable on your books for sales tax. You're paying a bill, and you just go in there and put the sales tax in the receivable, and then that way you got it covered. Audits, one real quick word on audits. Book of Discipline requires it. You have to do an audit. It doesn't say, and you veterans know this now, it doesn't say you have to use a CPA firm to do your audit. Now, that's the highest form of audit that you could get. And probably every couple of years, it wouldn't hurt to have an outside firm come in and do this. But for the disciplinary purposes, all you need to do is have a group come in and go through a checklist of things that relate to what an audit is. On the website for the treasurer, again, on my website, I have some audit guidelines that are excellent. They were prepared by the experts at the General Counsel on Finance Administration. You just go and download those, and they will walk you through everything you need to do for an in-house local church audit. I would caution you to use your finance committee to do the audit. You need some unbiased people who haven't seen all this stuff throughout the year, at least one or two. This is a great way to find somebody in your church and even your community who is versed in accounting, understands finance, that they can come in and you know, for a season, a year, they work to go through the checklist and provide an audit report. You just look at things like the bank statements, the credit card bills, you look at the paperwork for expenses, things like that, that will satisfy that need, and you sign off on it and report it to your church. Finally, on the payment presentation, there are helpful resources. And they have our website on there and other places that you can go to and use. Hopefully this will be very, very helpful for you. So that's really what I wanted to cover with 101. Are there any questions before we jump into the other thing we'd like to share with you tonight?
Mark, I don't see anything that came through to me or to everyone. You may have something directly, but Looks like you're doing such a good job. They're getting all the information they need.
All right, so let me shift to the next presentation that we want to talk about. Here. So what I want to do tonight now, this is the part of the night that I think I'm most hopeful for, but also have some angst. Because I want us to give you some strategies and some thoughts about what is it going to look like in the world of finance and stewardship in this post-pandemic world. I am praying every day this awful thing will finally get behind us, and we will live in the post-pandemic times. Every time you see a little bit of a hopeful gleam from the news that maybe we're getting there, and then another variant hits us or smacks us. I'm just really hoping we're preparing. But we do need to get ready, because if we are people of the gospel and we believe in good news, eventually we're coming out of this thing. And what's it going to look like? I'm going to offer some things tonight for you all to think about. It is out of the box thinking. I will readily admit that up front. It may make some folks uncomfortable, and that's okay, because prophetic utterances don't always make us feel comfortable. And it may not be for your church. And that's the important part I want you to hear. That some of these ideas may cause disruption in your church, and that's the last thing we want. So please hear me to say these are just some thoughts, some strategies, but to hear them with an open mind and see if there might be a way to help your church. So in terms of the pandemic, what have we learned? What have we experienced? The main thing we have learned is that membership and attendance has declined 50 to 60%. And that's probably not going to change a whole lot. I do think some churches have done very well during the pandemic, and others have really, really struggled. The majority, I think, have struggled. COVID has forced a new reliance on technology and change. And coupled with these first 2 points, you're going to see people who really want to be a part of your church, but they've gotten very used to watching it on Sunday morning in their pajamas with their cup of coffee in their hand. And the both and approach that Bishop Carter mentioned Sunday night in his keynote is probably here to stay. And if we want to be relevant, if we want to be reaching, to understand that this is how it's going to be going forward. Financially, we understand most of our churches did hold their own, praise God. The PPP loan, the payroll protection program, was a godsend. A lot of our churches took advantage of that. It was very, very helpful. The annual conference, we're very proud with our connection fund. We gave out over $750,000 to our churches to help with their clergy compensation and benefits, so that they could use those resources they had for other expenses. So amazingly, and we're even seeing it with this year's apportionment report. We've collected 86.5% of our apportionments, which is up there for the Western North Carolina Conference. The other side of this is because churches weren't as open as much, they didn't have as much programming going on, they weren't paying the heating and cooling bills they've been used to, they've been able to have surpluses for the year. And I've heard a lot of churches for 2021 into the year positive. And will that continue as we start to reopen and start using our programs and our buildings again? Who knows? I mean, it may start to tax that. So don't get used to that surplus. It's probably a lot because of saved expenses. But I hope that churches are becoming smarter about the way they spend their money, and prioritizing, which is crucial, comes along with the budget too. We just can't always do it the way it's always been done. And finally, normal, whatever that was, no longer exists. We keep talking, I want to get back to normal. I want to get back to normal. I don't think normal exists. And most of the research and the reading I did to get ready for tonight suggests that as well, that the new normal is really, really going to be new. What do we see trending? Well, evangelism is critical for sustainability. Methodists don't like that word, evangelism. I mean, there's a lot of negative associations with it, unfortunately. But you know, Wesley started the whole Methodist movement reaching new people. For years, we've had the church growth movement, but I had one person associated with all this that it wasn't the church growth movement, it was the church transfer movement. We would just transfer members back and forth. We need to be thinking about new people. And what are the ways and the strategies that we can reach people who in many respects are kind of open to branches of spirituality we haven't really considered before in a new way, that we might have an opportunity like we've never had before. Facilities may need reconfiguration. Do we need these rooms that we use for a couple hours a week to be sustained anymore? What are the ramifications of reconfiguring our facilities? We need a missional focus. I get mixed up with all these generational tags, Generation Z, X, MOUSC. And then there's the alpha generation, which is the children of today coming along. We do know they like missional focus. They like to be hands-on. They like to be doing things that make a difference and help people. And is our programming focused on that? Digital giving, digital electronic giving, however you call it, it's going to become 70% of the income. We were seeing it to be about 50-50 before the pandemic, but now it's going to be 70. And if your church is not set up to participate in digital giving, it's going to lose out. As David just said in his presentation, the younger generations today don't even carry cash. They text their money. Credit cards are actually going out of style, we're seeing, because they can do it through Zelle or Venmo or texting and all those kinds of things. Are you set up to receive that way? Mergers and adoptions becoming more common. We're seeing churches that are coming together and merging. And Methodists have been doing this for a long time with the charge approach. But instead of having two congregations on a charge, we may start seeing them on their own. We're not being forced from the conference. On their own, they are merging. Or adoptions, where a more stronger, viable church, doesn't have to necessarily be larger, will adopt a more struggling congregation, and the two partner together to help each other out. We're not seeing this trend as much right now in North Carolina, but those people that do this for a living are saying, because of remote work, because of the demand for people to not go into an office as much anymore, that they're relocating, they're wanting to work in their homes, they want to get out of the city. For the last 100 years, to find viable jobs, a lot of people had to leave the rural areas and go to the cities. And that may start to shift a little bit. It probably won't be cataclysmic, but you will see people wanting to move more out into smaller towns because they want to get out of the clutter of the city. And a lot of folks love return to the rural areas where they can do everything they need in their home as far as their work, but they're out of the city. So rural and small towns may actually start seeing a resurgence in the next 4, 5, 10 years. Your core of church members are more committed than ever. Now, they may be stressed out. They may be anxious. In fact, I would dare say every one of you on this call tonight is a part of that core. But you need the church like you've never needed it before. You love your church, and you want to see your church not only sustain itself, but be viable. That core is still going to be there, and God bless them. Love them. Use them. But be patient and pastoral with them, because we all have our wounds as we're coming out of this pandemic. And structure needs to be simpler. There are ways that we're moving to a less formal structure of our committees and our church organization. Your superintendent can help you with that. We've got a lot of things going on in the conference to help structure get simpler. These 4 things I share with you, and they're not new to me. They're not unique to me. They're probably not new to you. But when we think about it, as we've seen trending, relationship is more important than ritual. People want to be in some kind of community over and above participating in structural ritual events. And that doesn't mean ritual goes away. Oh, I'm not saying that at all. But relationship is important when who you do ritual with. Mission over membership, said that already a little bit. Conversation over conversion. Now, naturally, we want to bring people to Christ. And that's a very viable part of the church's mission. But rather than bumping them over the head in the old styles of evangelism for getting to a conversion, people want to talk about their faith. They want to be able to ask questions and not be judged. They want to have conversation. And faith is a lifelong journey, not a one-time destination. And that finally leads it over there, the trust over truth. As a preacher, that bothers me because I'm supposed to proclaim the truth. And the truth is there. I mean, the scriptures talk about the truth setting us free. But before we can proclaim the truth, there has to be trust. And trust with conversation and relationship, they all go hand in together. And this is what we see trending. So what are some new strategies to employ? Here we go. Are you ready to see something? Well, I got a couple questions, don't I, David?
Well, there was one I don't think you've answered, and it goes back. The digital giving through the conference, is that sent to the churches once a month still, or you did it?
It depends on what we try to send them out weekly. So there's about a week behind in receiving the gift and getting it to the churches, but we send those out weekly. Yeah. And then Dean emailed me, will this PowerPoint be shared or email? Yeah, if you didn't get it today, email me, mking at WNCC. I'll be glad to send it to you. That's right. We didn't put this out yesterday. We will put this PowerPoint out. I'm getting ahead of myself. We will put this out. Yes. We'll email it to you tonight. So what are the new strategies to employ? Get ready. Let's go through these very quickly. It's going to become a let's go versus y'all come. The old build it, they will come is going away. We need to be out in the community with what we have to share. Success must be redefined. It may not be numbers based anymore. It may not be achievement, the way we've always thought of success. Fruit bearing, and it's going to be cultural. It's going to be unique to your community of faith in your church. Smaller is the most norm. We always think bigger is better, but it may not be. People are looking for that relationship, for that community, and our smaller membership churches are primed to make a difference. And they're not going to maybe make a difference in the masses, but then it's the one person at a time that Jesus always was cared about anyway. And so what's wrong with reaching people one person at a time? Care for the core, I mentioned that earlier. Outside the box thinking on facilities. One of the challenges we're seeing today is our church buildings are getting older and roofs need to be replaced and heating systems have to be replaced and all these things for us to have a comfortable environment for people to come. We may have to do something differently related to that. Technology is here to stay. New people become the must reach. Stewardship becomes equally about giving and managing what we have. David talked about planned giving, legacy giving. We need to be putting steps in our churches that will allow for longevity. Bishop Carter mentioned the other day, we want a church that's not just for us, but will be there for our children and our children's children. So managing the resources we have today is important. I think we're going to move to a time where pastors become more bivocational. And churches may have tent making opportunities for their pastor. And this is nothing new. The Apostle Paul was a tent maker. And I often think that we think, why did God send Christ at that time in history? And one of the reasons I think it was is because the Roman road system was a marvel for that day and age, best the world had ever seen. And Paul could move throughout the Roman road system from city to city, setting up his little tent making enterprise and begin to start a church and relate to people who he made tents for, saying, I've got something to share with you that changed my life. Would you be willing to hear about it? So we may see our pastors doing that too. We may need our pastors working in hardware stores and hospitals and schoolrooms and office buildings, but they're doing that tent making, sharing of Christ. Then an entrepreneurial approach to capital raising that reaches out to the community, which means that we devise other sources of income for the church. So let me talk about that for just a moment. There is nothing wrong and there is no law that prohibits churches from engaging in the free enterprise of the 21st century American capitalism. A lot of people get very afraid of losing that tax exempt status when they start giving into other sources than giving for income. But there's no law that prohibits it. Now, the unrelated business income, the IRS, from what we understand in their policies, when you start generating of your income, your total income, to be 30% or more of unrelated business, which means you're doing things not churchy, you may jeopardize your exempt status. Because they're going to look at it and say, wait a minute, this ain't a church anymore. This is a business, and their 50% of their income comes from selling something. They may take away your taxes. So stay under that number. And 30% is important. Don't automatically assume all income outside of giving is UBI. I mean, we've been fundraising forever. I mean, the Southern Church knows how to do a chicken dinner, or a fish dinner, or spaghetti dinners. But when we started, those are all about unique ways of selling a product to raise funds. Nothing wrong with that. Barbecues, all those kinds of things. Bake sales. And then, even if it is unrelated business income, here's that fact. The UBI tax is a flat 21% of net income. That means it's income after all of your expenses, including cost of goods sold. And if you do have to pay 21%, think of it like this. That's 21 cents on every dollar. But you have 79 cents you have today that you didn't have yesterday when you engage in some enterprise. And so that 79 cents is better off, even if you have to give up. See, we want to keep the whole dollar, but better to get 79 cents than to have nothing at all. Property tax exemptions may also, particularly, like I said, if you depend on rental income to an unrelated party in your community, and there's a mortgage on that property, you may give up your property tax exemption. So you pay property tax. And the thing about property tax is it reduces your income for the UBI tax if you have to do it. So keep that in mind. Now, I'm saying these things, and I'm going to say it again until I turn blue in the face. This is not for every church, and do not start it overnight. You need to plan this. You need to have church unity built around this. Insurance, a business plan, structure, they all need to be considered. But what are some of the things that you might be able to do in this venue? Well, I'll put a list up here. This is just a brainstorming. Child care, preschool. I said last night, call it child care, not daycare. We're not caring for the day, we're caring for children. But this has been a ministry of the church forever. This is another way. Now, a lot of times churches just break even with preschool for child care, but let me tell you something. I think the reason for that is we try to keep our costs so low because we don't think people can afford it. Listen, parents are looking for ways to help their children in this day and age like never before, and the church has a trust factor like no other entity. And if there are for-profit child care centers out there doing it, the church can too. We just need to be a little more strategic in what we charge and how we pay our expenses. Same thing with before after school care. A food service, a food truck. We've been doing Wednesday night suppers forever. And we lose money on them because we don't think people will come to the church and pay for a meal. Listen, they go to restaurants all the time and they're willing to pay a lot of money in restaurants. What we need to do is look at our cost structure. And if you serve them really good food, not chicken nuggets out of a bag, but really good food, they will pay for it. And churches, a lot of churches have a commercial kitchen already set up. Now, yeah, you got to get into the health department and all that kind of stuff, but it might just be worth it. I put on here bakery and woodworking. And I know of a church, and this is so sexist, and I just have to apologize right off the bat with it. But I know a church, a gentleman had a burden. He was a woodworker. He was a woodman craft. And he had a burden for the teenage boys in his community being out on the streets or latchkey and not having real supervision, that he brought them in and he started teaching them woodworking in his church basement. And it caught on. The school even worked with him to let these boys out of school at lunchtime to come over and learn a trade. And they turned around and sold some really fine furniture to the community, and the church had an income. Well, in the same place, I thought, well, this isn't fair to the girls, so they just started a bakery for the girls. And in the same way, teaching these girls how to cook, they turned around and 2 days a week, they sold their bakery goods. On those 2 days, you had a line out the door waiting to buy them. Now, girls can learn wood making and boys know how to cook. They can be taught to cook. So get rid of the sexism in this illustration. It would work perhaps in your own church if you have these gifted people willing to take their time and do some service like this. Classes. I know of a church has an annual music camp every year, and they bring in some really good outside sources, and they charge for it. And people want their kids doing stuff during the summer, and a music camp is a great way to work with this. Cooking. The Methodist Church has some of the best cooks in the world. I'll put them up against Bobby Flay and any of them. I know some cooks in the Methodist Church that put them to shame. To do cooking classes. I know a church that does that. One night a week for 4 weeks, they had a cooking class. That turned people away. They didn't have enough room for them because the chef was coming in and teaching them ways to cook, and they made money off of it. We talked about rentals. Farming. A lot of our rural churches have so much land that's just sitting there. Could they not lease some of that land for farming? And right now it's very, very popular, from farm to the table kinds of enterprise. We have a church in Western North Carolina over in the mountains that's doing livestock and farming and selling this at a farmer's market. And the proceeds go to support the church, go back into the church. You got an empty gym that's not doing a whole lot anymore. You're not having ball teams as much anymore. Could you turn it into an exercise place? Sports clinic, fundraising suppers, concerts. And then there's real estate services, real estate development. There are ways, even our own conference, working with the Wesley Community Development that the conference started, is working with several projects with churches now that they're using their real estate for other than just what the church needs. And it has become a tremendous source of income and viability. And I'll show you a few in just a moment. Services. I saw videos at the end of the presentation, but we're going to run out of time tonight. I'm not going to be able to show it. But a guy starts a laundromat, and he was a truck driver. He made a lot of money as a truck driver. He started a laundromat, and he worked 3 or 4 hours a week with it. And you can just see the whole video. He's emptying out the coin things in his machine. Yeah, you'd have to take some investment. You got to purchase some equipment. You got to pay some staff. You got to set up and everything. But a laundromat could be a way of doing that. And then, of course, studios and PC centers. Now, I've thrown out these ideas, but I got to back up and say, if this is wanting you to just make money for your church, I want you to stop right now, because that's not what this is about. This is not just about making more money for your church. Every one of these has the potential for ministry and relationships and fostering conversation and developing trust in your community. That needs to be the focus. How can these entrepreneurial enterprises help your church reach out to new people in ways that you're not doing right now? For instance, with the laundromat, people got to wash their clothes. And a lot of poor people cannot afford to buy washing machines and dryers. And you could give them credits to come to your facility and wash their clothes. Now, we'll talk about a ministry there. I mean, it would just be amazing. Considerations that are critical: congregational support and unity. My gosh, do not let any of these tear your church up apart. If there's not a real sense of unity and support, just let it die. But you'll never know until you dip your toe in the water if the water is warm or not. So do keep that in mind. Failing to plan is planning to fail. Talk about a business plan is important on this. What's your risk tolerance? You may end up losing money over this. I knew of a church that started a big old bookstore in Manhattan, and they lost all their money on it because it wasn't ran well. It was not managed well. So you need to keep your risk tolerance, a business plan. Partnership with expertise, like working with Wesley. Please also get legal counsel on any private enterprise you do. Make sure you have adequate insurance coverages and talk to tax professionals. Make sure you just have all your things wrinkled out first before say, oh, this sounds so exciting, I want to start it tomorrow. You'll be better off planning if you do that. So a few examples. Let's say here's a church that basically leased their land to a development project. And as a result of the life of the lease, which was 50 years, they were getting $79,000 a year in income. How many of you would like to have $79,000 on land you're just sitting out there, not even being used? There are churches here who are using their facilities to put up a shopping center. Two churches came together, they're developing condos and things in their church. So anyway, all these are ways that you could possibly do that. If you're going to do real estate development, you need to have a development partner. And some of these other things need to be in consideration. Let me stop and see what questions we might have.
Mark, I don't see anything for everyone. I did put the link for Wesley Community Development in the group chat, and I did put this PowerPoint that you just finished in the group chat, but I know some people last night had some difficulty downloading from the group chat, so if you have a problem, we can get it to you.
I'll tell you on this last one, I will email it out to everybody that I emailed today. So if you do not get it by tomorrow, reach out to me personally, because maybe I did not get your email, you came in late, or registration, or there was a bounce back or something. Email me personally and I'll send it out to you directly. Well, that's what I had. David, do you have anything else yourself?
Mark, I just want to, for those that were on the call last night, just repeat kind of what I said at this point. I know that you might think, wow, putting a laundromat in the basement of the church sounds crazy. But Mark and I talked about this, especially last part that Mark just went through several times, and emailed about it and thought, you know, if there's one thing that the pandemic has taught us is that, number one, we have to do things differently, and number two, we have to think outside the box, no matter how crazy it sounds, because who would have thought that we would go into the third year of dealing with a worldwide pandemic? So, you know, these are ideas that may work for some of you, and they may not, but it has to start somewhere. And these are ideas where each of you and your ministries can be proactive about, as opposed to be reactionary like we all had to do with the pandemic. So, you know, we're not necessarily experts on some of the things that have been presented, but an idea has to start somewhere with someone. And you all are leaders in your churches and can't think of any better place for these ideas to take hold.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, David. You said it perfectly. Marilyn, you're asking us to talk a little bit about the property use assessment. Can you help me a little bit on that? What's that? Oh, David, do you know what
I put that in with the link with Wesley CD. What they do is they come in and they take your square footage of your physical property, and then they look at your ministries and look at how much usage the facility actually gets. And if you have had the opportunity to hear Joel Gillen, who's president and CEO of Wesley CD, talk about this, it's a very low percentage of building use that most of our facilities experience. And so when you go through that building use assessment, sometimes it can lead to, okay, we're only using this section of the building, 28% of the time. So what can we do with that part of the property at other times when it's not being used? So we just think about it. How many sanctuaries get used other than on Sunday mornings? Is there something else that can be done with that? Fellowship halls, Sunday school classrooms. Mark, so much of what he presented talked about food, bakery. What about our kitchens in our churches? Can they be used? And how much are they used, and can they be used? So you can talk to folks at Wesley to get more detail and to see if that's something that your church would be interested in.
Well, David, we have come to 8:32, and we both made a commitment to be very sensitive to time tonight. Thank you all for sticking with us, for being with us. It is our prayer that you at least took one or two things that will, for you veterans, is reaffirming for your work, and maybe you reminded of something. Ooh, I need to do that or check into that, and perhaps this last area gave you some ideas to pursue in your church. So I thank you, David. I know he thanks you. And to let you go, may I close us with a prayer. Gracious God, we are so thankful for these Christ-serving servants who deeply love you and your church, to be a part of this thing tonight, to be a part of the ministry they are doing where they are. For clergy who are called to a lifetime of service to your church. For laity who are called to give up resources, to give up time, to give up energy, to serve you in your churches. Bless them, Lord. Bless our conference, bless our congregations, our pastors. May we be sensitive and discerning of new opportunities, new challenges to reach a world that so needs everything you have to offer. And so we just give you thanks for tonight, for each other, and pray your blessings as we journey together. Together, Lord, never alone. Together. In Christ we pray. Amen.
Amen.
Amen. Good night.
Amen. Good night.
Good night.